I'm Colleen Connor of Audio Description Training Retreats and Blind Inspiration Cast, and you are listening to Audio Description Narrators of America, Know Your Narrator series.
Today, we're very happy to have Matt Shifrin with us. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Oh, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
What do you love about audio description?
Audio description is a very eloquent and energizing way for blind people to experience film, television, museums, amusement parks, whatever it may be. And it really gives blind people the opportunity to fully engage with whatever experience they've decided to do. It's a very thrilling and educational and energizing type of media access if done well.
I love that you use the word engagement too to kind of wrap it all up in a bow. Can you tell about the engagement and why that matters within the world of audio description?
Engagement is crucial because everything depends on the narrator. Not to put too much pressure on you, but everything depends on the narrator and how they interpret the script. Yes, they have a script and the script is kind of set in stone, but I think that the narrator has a little bit more wiggle room because the narrator, they could change something on the fly. If the script is off, they could fix it. But also the narrator engagement is crucial because the narrator is our guide through this experience. Let's say you're on a tour bus and you're a blind person on a tour bus and you're going on a tour. If the guide points out the window and says, "You see that thing over there? Mighty cool thing, isn't it?" You're going to be fairly disappointed with the quality of this tour guide. The same thing with these narrators. If a narrator sounds like this is the last thing they want to be doing, they hate their job, and they'd rather be at home watching a football game, then I am not going to commit to that narrator and thus to that show. But if the narrator is in it and is energized and is really with the story and engaged with the story and almost becomes a part of the story, a guide to the story, then the blind listener is going to be sitting there in rapt attention and listening to this person, because when you have a good narrator, when you have someone with guts and grit and glamour who's reading you this text, then you can trust them. As a blind person, you say, "Hey, this is my guide. I can trust him, and we're going to get through this together. We're going to go on an adventure."
What a great analogy with the guide. It's fun to imagine that as a narrator, whether I'm working in audio description or otherwise, I do bring intention. Like, why am I saying this, or who am I saying this to? That's at the forefront of where I'm approaching it. And I've also heard from audiences that there's also a balance that, as you said, you don't want someone who's just kind of not caring or not wanting to be in it. But I'm curious from your perspective, is there the opposite where it's like it's too much and it's like, okay, now you're kind of getting in the way of the story?
It just depends on how familiar the narrator is with the film, and it just really depends on the person. I personally like as many details as possible, but keep in mind, I kind of cheat. I have a friend who accidentally found out that he was a very good video describer, and we went to the movies together, and it was him, he's in his 50s, and another friend of mine who's in his 20s, like myself. And so a friend in his 20s and I are sitting there, and we are watching the first Avengers movie. And on screen, there is utter chaos. Aliens are attacking New York, Iron Man is flying around, repulsors are going off everywhere, and 15 minutes in, friend in his 20s has been trying to describe for 15 minutes, has miserably failed. I have no idea what's happening. And so I say, okay, friend in your 20s, you've tried, you've done good, you did good. Now, friend in your 50s, can you take over? And it turns out that the friend in your 50s is able to describe an action movie he's never seen on the fly. And it's fascinating because friend in his 50s had no experience with audio description before. Like, I told him about it, he knew it existed, but he'd never tried to do it. And this guy can describe the Marx Brothers. He can describe Marx Brothers movies with no script, live. I mean, he's seen them before, but he's able to do it with such pizzazz and such wit and such a love for the medium that it really makes you feel like you're there. And I think that, yes, some may say, oh, someone's over-describing. But we got to keep in mind as blind listeners, the only reason the person is over-describing is because they love this medium to bits. This is their passion. This is their joy. These are films that they've grown up with. These are films that they know like the back of their hand. So if people might be getting just a little bit too excited at that sequence, we really shouldn't blame them because they love this medium as much as we do.
And that passion comes through in your experience, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool. And it also sounds like you're addressing a really cool thing, audio description. I've used the word auteur before, where in audio description creation, there are many different roles. It's the writer who painstakingly goes through the movie or the series and writes out, usually in between lines of dialogue, the most relevant and important things that our blind audiences want as far as what's going on in the visuals. And then that gets handed off to a narrator who reads it. What I'm hearing from you is that here's your friend, you're both the 20-year-old and the 50-year-old, that each of them are performing two roles, both the with live description, that they're doing both the analyzing and the vocalizing.
Absolutely. And this type of thing is incredibly hard to do. I remember going to see a live performance of a circus, and I was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, and the poor describers were barely keeping up. It was evident that there were great gymnastic feats happening on stage, and acrobats and handstands and everything, but it kind of turned into sports commentary, and oh, he just did a handstand and goal, that sort of thing, because they just could not keep up with the eloquence of the motion, or elegance of the motion that was being portrayed on stage. And live description is incredibly tricky in that regard, because especially if it's a live performance like a circus, you may have seen the circus many times as a sighted describer. There are minute changes that happen from time to time, like in describing a theater production or play. And so people really try their best, but some people just have a knack for it.
And it sounds like that 50-year-old friend at the Avengers film sure did have the knack.
Oh, very much. It's also been an interesting process because this friend and I, he is a big comic book guy. And so we kind of started this project where I was thinking about how blind people could read comic books. And my dad used to read me Spider-Man comics as a kid, and it was really cool because he described all of the panels and the pictures and what was happening. And it was really fascinating to me as a blind kid because I wasn't really familiar with the characters, but it was really cool to have such kind of unbridled free reign within the story and to be able to really understand what was happening. It was also cool for my dad because my parents are from Russia and there are no comics in Russia. They did not exist when my parents were growing up. And it got interesting because I was a kid, he was reading me these comics, and then as I grew older, I really wondered kind of how blind people could access comics on their own. And I said, you know, these people aren't improvisers. They're not just, comic book writers don't just think of stuff and just scribble notes. I mean, there's got to be a scripting process. Lo and behold, I Googled and found the Comic Book Script Archive, which is a website of comic book scripts where people literally write, panel 1, Peter Parker swings in from panel left and ricochets off a lamppost, his webs barely catching in time to save him from smacking face first into the pavement. I don't know. Panel 2, Doc Ock follows in hot pursuit. And these descriptions are very detailed because the writer gives this script to the artist who then draws. And what's interesting is when you compare this script to the actual comic book, there is practically zero variation. These rules that the scriptwriter puts out, these story beats are upheld to a T, which makes it very easy to adapt comic books for blind people. And so this 50-year-old friend and I, we took an issue of Daredevil about the blind superhero, and it was interesting because one of the Daredevil writers, Mark Waid, quite a prominent man in the comic book industry, had tried to make his own audio comic book version for blind people. And it was a valiant effort. But the trouble was that it wasn't acted very well. These were well-meaning editors and copyists and writers sitting in a room trying to act out this comic book. And it was a wonderful first effort, and then it never really continued. So this friend in his 50s and I went to a comic book convention. We hunted down Mark Waid, and I said, hey, you know, this is great, but could I have access to your script? Because then I'd be able to kind of make this even more interesting. And he said, yeah, sure, here you go. And then I had this script, and this friend in his 50s and I, we made a 3D sound radio drama based on the Daredevil comic. And 3D sound is sound that's all around your head. It's behind you, above you, below you. And kind of we're making this radio drama, and I'm a composer by training, so I got to write the music for it, which was a lot of fun. But then we make this radio drama, and I was thinking, well, there's got to be a way to immerse blind people in the experience beyond audio. I was thinking about virtual reality experiences where you put on these goggles and you are immersed in a virtual world. And I tried them on. I went to Sundance and they had virtual goggles there. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. I put them on and nothing worked because it's for sighted people. And so I thought, how could you make a virtual reality experience for blind people? And I have a friend who works at the MIT Media Lab, and they make all kinds of wacky technology over there. And I said, hey, could you make a motion simulating helmet? This helmet that you wear that uses these spinning gyroscopes, these spinning tops to affect your vestibular system and control your sense of balance. So that when you're sitting in a chair, could we make it that you could feel like you're falling or flipping or flying, any acrobatic motion? And he said, yeah, I'll work on it. And so we started Project Daredevil, which is our startup that's creating this helmet, and we're working on crafting it now and hoping to have it out in about a year or so.
How exciting. And what a great step-by-step process each discovery that you and your friend made just got it to the next level. Who would have thought that, your parents reading you comic book bedtime stories would lead to a gyroscopic helmet? This is great.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things that struck me a lot too was the comic book script archive. That, if I remember correctly, we're recording this in the end of July 2020. That Neil Gaiman has made some sort of public statement, whether it was on social media or official, that Sandman, his graphic novel, is going to be adapted into an audiobook. Does that sound along the same lines of what you're exploring if we were to take a few steps back to the comic book archive?
Very much. So basically, I haven't heard the audiobook yet, but basically what Gaiman did was he went through his Sandman scripts and adapted them slightly for a more narrative radio approach, and then had actors read the parts and people do sound design. But basically, he's going pretty much off of his original scripts. So imagine that Sandman audiobook, but with motion simulation as things are happening in the book, which could be very interesting simply because the Sandman is an abstract I can't pronounce it. Anthropomorphization. Thank goodness. Anthropomorphization of these characters. And what's interesting is these characters kind of glide along in the universe unseen by a lot of other characters. So what would it feel like to be dreams switching from world to world? I mean, that's what the helmet's for.
Yes. And it sounds like that helmet really accomplishes something beyond the 3D, the binaural recording that you were referring to, that it adds yet another immersive experience.
Oh, very much. And kind of expanding beyond blind people. A lot of video gamers who I've talked to have been really hoping for a more immersive experience in the games they play. And they've been saying, there's a Spider-Man game, for example, that was made on the PlayStation a couple of years ago. And they said, this is a great game, but I mean, it's us and a controller and a screen. We're not really feeling involved in the process. And just imagining this helmet connected to a mainstream video game where you could really immerse yourself in that experience of being this character, it would really be a step forward in kind of the entertainment field in general, and the gaming field in general.
Curious about your experience in this process with the helmet. Can you share an example of maybe a challenge that you're really proud of how you overcame it in this, that you'd feel comfortable sharing?
I think one of the main challenges is really being able to, this is a very multifaceted device. And I think one of our main challenges was being able to understand how to best pitch it in business competitions. And so in Boston, there's a summer business program called Mass Challenge. And they come into this program and they teach you how to do entrepreneurial things and how to run a startup. And so kind of a lot of our time before we pitched to Mass Challenge was really spent in how do we approach this helmet from multiple perspectives, from a pitching, advertising, kind of marketing, please get us into this program standpoint, so that it will be interesting not only to comic book fans, not only to blind people, not only to people in the kind of entertainment industry, but just to people in general. Joe Schmo, the venture capitalist, may not care about comics or games or anything like that. but we need to get Joe Schmo on board. What's our approach? How do we tell this story? And how do we engage Joe Schmo in all these different experiences that we've had while crafting this helmet so that Joe Schmo will help us get into mass talent? And it was a really interesting experience because this pitching that we did was a lesson in storytelling. And it wasn't just about the helmet. It was also about experiences as a blind person and how much this helmet helps blind people feel like they're part of an experience, very much like audio description itself. And these kind of audio dramas, they're not just an adaptation of the comics. They're a way for a whole chunk of the population to be able to engage in a medium that they have never been able to access before. And it was just really fascinating crafting that story and really kind of rehearsing that pitch with the guy from the media lab. We had all these hand gestures that we had to learn, and we had to do imitations of the Hulk, and it was glorious.
And that media lab experience sounds like you said, it's like audio description. How meta to be able to provide this storytelling, and I guess craft the story that you're sharing about access in a way that is targeted to the audience in the same way that our audio description audiences are making sure that they're getting the best the sighted audiences get.
Oh, very much.
Obviously, this helmet has got to be forefront on your mind. How do you see that or other aspects of audio description, wherever you want to take this question? Where would you like it to be? Where would you like audio description to go?
I think, stepping back for a second, in a previous episode of Know Your Narrator, Satana Howry had talked about how audio description really helped her understand the world and learn about the world and parts of the world that she had not been able to access as a blind person. And kind of this helmet is kind of on the front burner, but I'm also working on text-based building instructions so that blind kids can build Lego sets on their own. And Lego just recently released text-based building instructions for 25 of their new sets, and they're hoping to expand that to many, many more in the next few months. And it's really been a wonderful process collaborating with Lego. And these instructions were a project that a friend and I started. It was just for fun. My friend knew Braille. She created an entire language of ways to name different Lego pieces. Put a flat 3x1 vertically on the front row of the flat 6x4. Repeat symmetrically to the right, for example, would be an instruction that you'd see. And these instructions were kind of crafted and refined. And what this project really helped us do is it helped blind people. My friend is sighted who made these instructions. And the way it really helped me was to help me understand the world around me in a completely different way. When you build the Sydney Opera House or the Tower Bridge or Big Ben or a sports car, I mean, we've all ridden in cars. They get us from place to place. But if I wanted to know what a car looked like, I'd literally have to climb up and lie down on the hood and over the roof and onto the trunk. The driver would not be happy. When you build something realistic that you know exists, but that you've never had personal experience with out of a Lego set, the Washington Monument, for example, then you're able to really understand this architectural landmark in a new way, and you're really able to have a personal relationship with it. You're thinking to yourself, oh, well, this is, I don't know, let's take the Statue of Liberty, for example. You can say, oh, this is what Wolverine slides down in the first X-Men movie. Or, oh, this is what gets destroyed in all the action movies. The Golden Gate Bridge, oh, they blew that up in this movie and that movie and the other movie, and Godzilla ate it, or whatever. Susanna was just talking about kind of how much the Washington Monument Project helped her. And it's been really interesting with these text-based instructions. They are a form of audio description. They're text-based description, but they're basically very detailed directions that tell you how to build a thing. And it's an interesting approach just because it enables blind people to really get a sense of not only objects that exist, like, I don't know, the Triumphal Arch in Paris, but also fictional objects. No one I know has a Millennium Falcon that I can fly around. They just don't. Doesn't exist. No one has a Batmobile that I can jump in. But when you're able to build these fictional items out of Lego, then you're really able to understand them in a whole new way because you understand how they're built, how they work. You built them. They're yours, in a sense.
There's got to be, as you started talking about the access of audio description in so many different areas, that this kind of feels very similar to a museum experience. That this building of the Lego sets, well, some people would incorrectly dismiss it as, oh, it's just a toy. That this is really another form of access that gives a connection that might otherwise not be there.
Oh, very much. And one might argue that, let's say you go to a museum, there are going to be do not touch signs everywhere. And either
Yes.
you sneak a peek at a sculpture with your parents standing guard, or you just can't touch it. But this Lego approach really helps it helps you build a miniature world. And audio description in museums is incredibly valuable because I don't know, if there's a giant tree on the ceiling, you're not going to climb up there and touch that tree. It's impossible.
Mm.
And having this description it depends on the museum, of course, but the best kind of description is, in my opinion, the kind that is interlaced with the history of an object or the history of a space or the people who inhabited said location. And this integrated audio description really helps not only blind people, but sighted people who use audio guides. They find it valuable as well because it helps orient them to whatever they're looking at. Not only are they getting historical context, but they are really getting insight into the object itself. And that's also very valuable as a sighted person. If you know nothing about where to start with a sculpture or painting, I mean, yes, you see that there is something painted there, but how to approach it from a kind of comprehension standpoint, that's where the audio description may be valuable to sighted people as well.
What a great perspective of object access, right?
Very much.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audiences?
Yeah, I think the key thing as a blind person is to take objects around you and take experiences that you've had and always think about where they can go next. For example, I had this Lego project and I started rock climbing with a group of disabled rock climbers. And it was an interesting experience because I realized that the blind rock climbers were at a significant disadvantage because they couldn't plan how they climbed before they climbed. And there was someone yelling at them, basically telling them where different rocks were. But unlike a sighted climber who's able to look at a rock wall and think about their process and strategize, blind people weren't able to do that, well, because they're blind. And so I thought to myself, okay, I have this Lego project. How can I use this medium to make this sport more accessible? And so I thought, well, you can build these rock walls out of Lego. You can just use different Lego pieces to demonstrate, kind of to represent different types of rock climbing holds. And then you lay them out on a base plate, and then the person giving directions, or caller as they're known, is the one who would build it. You feel it, and then you climb it. And it really my whole method of climbing, my whole technique changed when I started to use this Lego system because I was able to really think about my body's positioning in space, proprioception as they call it. And it was really fascinating to see how much that improved and how much I was able to understand my body better and control it better because I had a plan. It wasn't just, oh, I'm gonna just grab these random things so I don't swing out like a wrecking ball into the middle of the gym. There was much more understanding about the goal and how to reach it. I think it's crucial for blind people to always consider how they can innovate, no matter in what area, because they are problems will not be solved on their own unless there are people solving them. And the people who are going to be solving any problems are the people who are experiencing them. Therefore, blind people should be the ones who are always solving problems, no matter how small, because otherwise no one will know that this is a problem unless you say, hey, I have an issue, here's how I solved it.
I'm overwhelmed by so many angles of helmets and Lego sets and Wolverine climbing objects. And in all seriousness, your consideration of innovation has obviously led to some really great actions and results. And it's so good to hear the approach that you've shared and how not only other blind people can also innovate on their perspectives, but also how you've approached the business sector and been able to get the buy-in, whether it's from MIT or the Boston business side. This kind of connection is it's just great.
I think another crucial aspect of it is thinking about outreach. So, for example, I wanted to start a podcast, and I was thinking, well, what's my approach? And I went and I Googled, and there's a organization, PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. They're a group of podcast makers who work with NPR. And I said, okay, here's my way in. Now I want to make a podcast called Blind Guy Travels. Who do I know whose podcast is made by PRX? So I found a guy, I sent him an email. He had no idea who I was. I was just a random guy off the street. And I said, hey, here's my idea for a podcast. Who can I contact at PRX who you think would be interested? And he said, oh, well, here's so-and-so, here's her email. And the podcast is coming out in February or March. And so why do I say this? I say this because outreach is crucial. And sure, a lot of people reach out, but maybe someone doesn't get back to you. When reaching out to people, it's important to always juggle what you can offer, but also always consider what they would get out of it. So when I wrote these people, I don't know of any blind people in mainstream podcasting. Mainstream meaning like stuff that's on NPR. There are wonderful podcasts by Blind Bargains or Thomas Reed of Read My Mind, and they're absolutely wonderful. And they are not necessarily geared towards the mainstream. So I kind of approached these people at PRX, basically saying, hey, here is what it's like for a blind person to travel. What's it like for a blind person to go to New York and audition for grad school as a singer? What's it like? What's that experience like? What's it like to go to museums, go to the movies? Some experiences that sighted people do daily, that sighted people kind of take for granted and really revel in. How can we take these experiences and approach them from a different standpoint? Oh, I know how. Here is how. And that was what they would be getting. And so I think the crucial thing for blind people when it comes to self-advocacy is always thinking kind of from both sides. Not only from, I want access to blah, but really thinking about what this company or entity or organization, what they would get. Could you give them positive press? Could you give them kind of a new type of technology? Could you give them a new type of experience? And I think that the more that blind people are able to think on kind of in a multifaceted way, the more likely it is that there will be more innovation. The more we think, the more innovation. And the more people we consider in our process, the more innovation.
This has been a wonderful experience to know what you've done and the way that you've outreached. And thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that with our audience.
Thank you so much. I just realized I totally didn't answer your question of where is audio description going? And the reason I didn't answer it is because it's been answered wonderfully by other people. David Wallace talked about audio description in video games. And it's interesting because video games have become more accessible in the past couple of months. There was a lot of hype around The Last of Us 2 and its accessibility for disabled video gamers. But one thing that they did not do was describe the cutscenes and the scenes that happen in between gameplay. And I thought, my goodness, this is so easy to describe because even video games run on scripts. The Spider-Man game I mentioned earlier, there's a whole script book that you can buy, which has 200 pages of not only what the characters say, but the descriptions of these cutscenes, where they're taking place, who is doing what, how they're dressed. And it wouldn't be that difficult to kind of have them narrated and then have some sort of small sound cue to indicate that the cutscene is over and that gameplay can resume. It's been done in games for the blind, and so expanding it to sighted video games wouldn't be too difficult, I would think. And the only reason I'd argue that that's important is just because in contemporary video games, at least, cutscenes are used for so much of the storytelling and character development and really understanding why we do what we do in the game.
Matthew, how can people reach you?
The easiest way would be through legofortheblind.com, and there's a contact link at the bottom, and they can find me there.
Thanks so much.